Okay, with that, because I've been thinking more about this lately, where does stress come from? And in our modern lives, I think we have a lot of new forms of stress that are, we haven't taken a good look at.
Hmm. Well, in my opinion, and this goes back to like Hans Selye, we were kind of talking about him a second ago. Um, Stress is, in my opinion, anytime your body cannot produce enough energy for that particular need, it will produce some sort of stress, biological stress in your body to kind of keep up with your demands. So it can come from a multitude of things. And in today's modern world, we have an abundance of stressors out there that are kind of triggering us all day long. I mean, sitting in front of your computer all day can be a stress. Social media can be a stress, pollution, poor diet, not getting enough nutrition, your training sessions, your relationships, your work, environmental toxins. I mean, they're all over
Hmm.
the place. You really can't avoid them. And the goal shouldn't be to avoid stress. The goal should be to build a body and to build health that can manage the stressors in your
Hmm.
life, and then make sure that you have the things in your life that can support you so you can heal from those things, like making sure you can have enough sleep, getting enough optimal food and nutrition. That's the way we're going to be able to manage it in our lives. But
Hmm.
when you are inundated with it 24/7, which we are in today's world, right? I mean, we go outside less now, we move less, we have more ultra processed foods than ever in our world. There's so many things that are kind of hindering us from being able to be healthy. So we have to really kind of use common, or we have to think about things a lot more now.
Hmm.
Before, your only options for food were like fresh foods. Before, you
Right.
had to get outside and get in your car and walk more and get outside more just naturally. Now you don't have to do any of those things if you don't
Hmm.
want to. We've created environments that have made our life so convenient and almost to a fault, and it's not helping us anymore. So
Hmm.
now you have to actually like plan in your day to get outside. You have to plan in your day to make sure you eat
Exactly.
good foods. You have to plan all these things, which again takes time and energy to do all those things. So it's like,
Hmm.
has it made it easier on some level? Yes, but it's also made it more challenging because now we have to contemplate and think about the right choices.
Mm. I love that. One thing that cracks me up these days is we are kind of planning and scheduling out our time to be more ancestral. Like I just have to go outside and put my bare feet on the grass, stuff like this. It's fun.
One 100%. Things that we would just do instinctually before, we would
Hmm.
just do those things, right? I mean, we would
Right.
just walk outside and be outside a lot more. We just don't anymore because we don't have to, and we have too many things inside now that can keep us inside. So yes, you're right. People plan, they put it in their calendars, go out, get morning sun, go for a walk, and if not, their days fill up and they just don't get it done.
Right. I mean, I do it as well. There's no judgment. It's funny in our modern world.
That's right.
And with that, maybe for my audience a little bit, because I know we're probably on the same page about a lot, but in terms of stress in this modern age, or just like you said, all those factors of diet and lifestyle, what are maybe some of the first steps we could start taking to address what we believe is the fundamental issue of energy availability? And I know that that could be very broad, obviously, but
Well, I mean, energy availability is basically looking at what produces energy within your cell. I'm assuming that's what you're asking. And
mhm,
the primary things are usually a fuel source. So it could be carbs, protein, or fats, right? So you need fuel. Protein is normally not a primary one. So we use carbs and fat as your primary fuel source. Then you need an abundance of nutrition. And because in the biological process of you producing energy, you use multiple vitamins and minerals to kind of change that initial component into ATP. Then you need oxygen. Without oxygen, none of this would happen. And then you need, as I refer to it as thyroid or thyroid hormone, because it's kind of the conductor in the cell, kind of telling everything to quicken up or tell everything what to do. I usually assess that those are your primary four things that you need to produce energy. And if you
okay.
don't have those, if you have a lack of fuel, you're going to have a issue, at least doing it healthfully. If you have a lack of any of those nutrients, you're going to have a problem because again, the whole system won't work as well without these certain nutrients. Obviously, with a lack of oxygen, it's just not going to work at all, and that's going to no energy at all is going to be produced. And then of course, thyroid, you can certainly have low thyroid and still produce energy, but it's going to be a lot slower. You're not going to produce as much over time. So the thyroid is there to kind of keep up. And give you and produce an abundance of energy so that you can kind of fuel your system and then also keep up with all of your external demands, exercise, work, all those things, so that you can keep up with those things. So
Hmm.
when all of those things are there, then I would say someone has a healthy metabolic rate and can produce an abundance of energy. And if they're lacking, then you're going to struggle.
Right. Just some of the symptoms of like a low energy state. I know because that's why when I found Ray, that's kind of where I was coming from. I feel like I was just caloric restricting my calories, not eating enough carbs.
Yeah. I mean, if you've ever been on a diet, which a lot of people have, and restricted too much, I mean, obviously, for you to lose weight, there has to be some level of caloric deficit that occurs. You have to kind of consume less than your body needs, so it
Hmm.
will burn into you. But if someone goes too dramatic or they're not providing themselves with enough carbs to kind of fuel the nervous system, and then the body will start to go some adaptive measures. And usually what that happens is, yes, it'll start producing fatigue, lower energy, constipation, lower hormone function, you won't sleep as well, you get colder. All of those things will start to happen over time. If
Hmm.
someone does a caloric deficit properly, and doesn't go too extreme, then you usually can do just fine, because usually,
Okay.
obviously, when you're dipping into yourself, we're still providing the cells with fuel. It's just from you. And as long as it's not a ton of polyunsaturated fats is coming out of your fat tissue, which maybe it could be. But as long as it's not, the body will use those resources to kind of keep up its demands. And yes, and
Hmm.
over time, your basal metabolic rate might drop a little bit solely because you're just going to weigh less. And so, if you are just smaller in size, yes, then you will burn less calories. But ultimately, if you can continue to work on, maintaining muscle mass, making sure that your primary functions are maintained, then usually you can do that quite well without having a massive adaptation at the end of that deficit.
Okay. It brings me to a good question. I had a few people ask. I was kind of like crowdsourcing a few questions, and a lot of
Yeah.
people, you said like the PUFA in your stores, and just a few questions about that. I don't know if you can talk to that at all, of like how long it can potentially take people to detox, and if you can potentially speed it up, different ways. But also, is it, if we're under stress, do we preferentially release PUFA? Is it just because we tend to store more of it? And so when
Your
it's released.
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, your body actually will prefers to store PUFA because it
Hmm.
knows its breakdown products are kind of toxic. So it will actually prefer to burn saturated fats over polyunsaturated fats. So that's the normal cycle. So our body will try to store the PUFA over the saturated fat if it's going to
Hmm.
store anything. And the thought process is it takes about 4 years. Let's just say that all of a sudden, you were on a high PUFA diet and now you consume more saturated fat and carbs. And the thought process, even if you don't lose weight, it'll take about 4 years for your body to shift its fat stores from PUFA to more saturated. And because your body is slowly kind of cycling the fat
Hmm.
in your tissue, and that's probably a safer way to do it because you're kind of trickling it out and kind of, re just storing and then dropping some of the PUFA. Now, certainly, if somebody was trying to lose fat, the percentage, obviously, they're going to have less of percentage. I think the cycling system would still kind of apply there, but obviously, they'll just have less in general because they're going to be losing body fat. The question for a lot of people is if you have been on a high PUFA diet in the past, it's probably best if you're trying to lose fat to do it quite slowly.
Hmm.
Because yes, you are going to kind of burn a little bit more PUFA at that period of time. And so you want to do it slow and steady, not super fast, because that can be more detrimental. And PUFAs can have a negative reaction or a negative response within the cells and how they actually produce energy.
Gotcha. Interesting. Thanks for that.
Mhm.
I had always heard about 4 years too. And so, I know in health spaces I've heard probably, I mean, obviously the best thing you could do, I guess, if you're trying to detox them would just be cut them down as much as possible, basically.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, ingesting less of them is certainly
Yeah.
one thing to do, but your body still will have a storage of them. And
Right.
so if they do, again, the only way we're going to know what someone's fat is made out of is to cut it off them and then test it. So everyone has some level of percentage, and we see that in animals. If we give animals a low PUFA diet, their body fat or their fat consumption changes. It does become more saturated over polyunsaturated. We see that in pigs that eat a more saturated fat diet because currently most pigs are eating a very, corn, soy, high PUFA diet. So the fat that's in these pigs is high in PUFA, whereas it didn't
Mhm.
used to be years and years ago, right? And I know farmers have changed the feed of their pigs and they've made a pig fat or their bacon or whatever is much higher in saturated fat over PUFA. So you can change the composition for sure of your own
Mhm.
fat. But like I said, I've read everything I've read is yes, there's like a 10% so or 10, 20% turnover that'll naturally just happen within your tissue.
Mhm.
And so the length is normally about 4 years is when it could be completely turned over if you changed your diet.
Good to know. I think that's a key factor. It might bring me to the next one, which, I want to ask you about sugar
Mhm.
and how I think that plays a big part into things. If you have a lot of PUFA stored, and you hear typically from people maybe they don't handle carbs or sugar well, or even they might be diabetic. I know I tended to suffer from a little bit of what I have to consider pre-diabetes from just my symptoms. And to this day, though, if I probably cut poof out of my diet for about 3 years or so. It's
Mhm.
like I'm on the up and up. But when I eat it, like if I stray at all, I mean, a more natural source like salmon or something that might be better. But if I stray every now and then and eat some poofa, it's like it's so noticeable and it almost makes me feel diabetic in the moment. I feel my blood sugar destabilize and I got the itis, we call it after the meal, and you want to pass out. And it's like, oh yeah, for me. But so combining that with carbs and sugar in the modern American diet, it's almost just like an unholy combination.
Well, I mean, if you're asking like a high usually it's ultra processed foods are filled with corn oil, safflower oil. They're all kind of the, seed oils, and then they're just high calorie, and then they combine them with tons of other calories in general. I think what just happens is you just leads to overconsumption.
Hmm.
If the specifically the United States, 70% of our food is ultra processed, and that's most people's diets. And so they're just eating empty calories with sugar, but
Hmm.
a ton of other poor fats and flour and God knows what else. And so it's just leading to them to overconsume these crappy foods. Then obviously, then yeah, you're just going to store and store and store. And
Hmm.
a lot of them aren't eating enough protein, or they're eating excessive amounts of protein, depending on what kind of diet they're on. But they're essentially not very stabilized. And then again, these foods just lead to people eating too much. If you innately
Hmm.
can only consume 2,000 calories, but you're eating 2,500 calories and it's ultra processed, yeah, you're going to put on weight, you're going to gain fat, and you're going to get all of the other things that are going to go along with that. Dysregulated blood sugars, and on and on and
Hmm.
on.
Hmm. Yeah, I agree. And so I'd love to get your take on. I've been thinking about this recently, just refined sugar versus more natural sources like honey, maple syrup, and fruit juice.
Mhm.
I tend to use them all, but I know that's a very common question and just not an argument, but debate I get into people, you know. And I always love to hear people's different opinions on it.
So sugar is just sucrose. It's 50% fructose, 50% glucose. And then you have fruit and like honey. And honey is like, I think, 55% fructose, 45% glucose.
Mm,
Slightly different than pure white sugar. Fruit obviously has sucrose and then individual fructose and glucose molecules. The difference with like fruit is obviously it has nutrition in it, so that's beneficial. White table sugar or just refined sugar doesn't have any nutrition in it. And so I think as we were talking, if you're defining a health food as a food with a lot of nutrition in it, then sugar would not be in that category. But if you change the definition of what health is, meaning, well, what if something is an easy to digest carbohydrate that's good and it's good energy for your cells? Well, that would be sugar, and that would be defined in that category as a good thing. And so it's not
mm,
inherently bad, and sugar by itself can be used for a lot of people. A lot of people that have GI distress and can't break down things very well and are having a hard time with energy production, then white sugar can be used quite easily because again, there's no
Hmm.
waste. It's all digested in the first 10 centimeters of your small intestine, gets into the system, and it can be provide a clean source of energy for that individual without that individual having to work very hard to get that. Now, sugar and so it basically just is a good fuel source. Of course, you can't produce energy with just sugar. You do need nutrition. And so you could combine that with a nutrient-rich diet that has other sources in it so you can get the nutrition. And and you can use it as a percentage of your calories, right? And like again, but should that be like your primary fuel source? Probably not, right? You're,
Right.
you're not getting enough of the nutrition side of things. But can it be used as a fuel source in the context of it's easy to digest, your body can use it very easily, there's not a lot of waste, and the cells can kind of use it and produce energy as long as there's other food sources there? Sure.
Hmm.
Most people get stuck with sugar because they think of like sugary sweet foods, right? Most people are just not gobbling tablespoons of sugar. They are eating a cookie, chocolate, or cake,
Hmm.
or ice cream, high calorie foods that not only contain sugar, but they usually contain a ton of fat. And so, and if you actually broke down most of those foods, they would probably be more fat calories in them than sugar calories, anyways. But because they're sweet, we label them as sweets. So
Right.
we should label them as fats. But
Yeah.
ultimately, right, when you change someone's, if I said, look, when you're craving something sweet, instead of picking, a cookie or cake, you can drink like 6 or 8 ounces of orange juice, wait 10 or 20 minutes, and normally that craving will go away immediately,
Hmm.
right? And that's kind of what we want. And when we start to learn that, we're like, huh, that's weird. I'm not really needing that anymore. I'm not feeling like I need to go and that immediately went away for them. So when they start to learn that, I'm like, okay, now if you do that through the day, combined with your meal, having some orange juice or some fruit, normally what happens is by night, because they've been fueling their system with these easy to digest carbohydrates, that desire or need or that craving or everything that they've been experiencing normally starts to dissipate. And so
Hmm.
it's not a matter of trying to, white knuckle themselves through not eating a lot of these foods. It's like, how do we support your body throughout the day so that when we get to that point, it kind of, whatever you've done throughout the day, it helps you dissipate that feeling. And that way you're not going into eating all these foods, right? We want to make it so it's easy for you. And when we support you, it will be. It's not about, willpower or grinding it out or I'm going to resist it or, because that just doesn't work long term.
Right.
Yeah.
I'm so glad you said that because I mean that's what I would have gone into next of how one thing I love about the repeat space is how like it's out about including the best things. I feel like it's not about restricting all the
Hmm.
bad things that are out there. I mean, sure, there's a level of that. You don't want to get too much PUFA and all these other like toxic things in the food supply, but it's almost more about like covering your bases is about, you know, getting as much of the good stuff in you that you can pretty much. Whereas a lot of these other diets are just so restrictive, even if it's just the mainstream. And to your point, I mean, about cutting calories isn't always harmful, but I think sometimes people get stuck in that just hole that they can't dig themselves out of. But
For sure. And
mhm.
again, everything's in stages and right? It's not good or bad, but if you've been eating restrictively for years and years and been on a diet for the last 5 years, you've never been off of it, you're always off and on. And mostly those people are doing some sort of restriction and they're binging, restriction and binging. You got to get off that roller coaster. And normally those
Mhm.
people like, look, you kind of have to work on your foundation first. You probably need to figure out what you're missing so that you can feel normal. And so we can support you throughout the day so that you don't feel like you have to restrict and binge. And then, other symptoms improve. Let's pay attention to your body temperature and pulse. Let's pay attention to your digestion. Let's pay attention to your sex drive or your cycle if you're a woman, or how well are you sleeping. We need to pay attention to all of those things. And then when those improve, and if you're still looking to lose some body weight, then we can create a program where you can, put slight deficit in there, but still feel good and still feel supported so you don't feel like you're, like I said, starving yourself or
Mhm.
hungry all the time. Because those diets that make you feel that way, they're people think about food all the time. And it's so much mental gymnastics to not, and they're just like, I want to eat, I want to eat. You can only keep up with that for so long until you binge.
Mhm. I'll just say there was a person, an influencer, saying endotoxin is caused from just eating too much white sugar. And I know there's other concerns with, like we were saying, just the, like if that's all you're eating, just the pure lack of nutrition is a problem. But I've never heard that it just directly causes endotoxin. I mean, like,
Yeah, I've never heard that.
yeah,
Y- so endotoxin is a bacterial toxin, right? That your bacteria make, and your bacteria are located in the colon. So most everyone produces some level of endotoxin in their colon because you have bacterial toxins. And the fact that most white sugar breaks down literally within the first 10 centimeters of your digestive tract, right? It's broken down into sugar molecules or glucose, fructose, again, and it goes basically into the liver. There's nothing left really to go into the colon. So there's
right.
very little left. Usually the endotoxin component are usually fibrous materials, waste that gets into the colon that starts to feed bacteria. And then those will start, and the bacteria are producing the endotoxin, right? So
Hmm.
sugar can't produce endotoxin. And then what ends up happening is if someone starts to finally get, they'll have some sort of the bile salts get into the colon, which they really shouldn't be, but sometimes they get down there. The endotoxin will then attach to those bile salts and they'll go back into the liver and then they can get through the blood system that way. But
Mm,
I've never heard of anything that sugar produces endotoxins. So
yeah,
um, I would have to see a study that actually says that, but it doesn't make any sense to me.
right. It was kind of weird because I don't know, all the they hit the nail on the head about endotoxin on a lot of other things, and they're like, and then that's why you got to stay away from white sugar too. It surprised me. I was like, there's other, I've heard plenty of other arguments you want to say maybe stay away from sugar, but that one kind of shocked me.
Yeah, I mean, I would usually produce because it's more the things that are going to feed the bacteria, and then like again, and the bacteria are going to produce the endotoxins. So
Right.
they're bacterial toxins, right? So essentially, it's things that would feed bacteria, and usually those are things that are going to actually make it to the colon. So fibrous material, starch
Hmm.
material, anything that's going to get down there. White sugar doesn't really make it down there. There's like
Right.
very little waste, so I wouldn't see how that would even happen.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, thank you for that. It's,
Mhm.
and yeah, that's one thing I love about particularly like this way of eating with just fruits and more sugar and less of the starch and fibrous material like you're saying. I for years, I mean over a decade, ate so many just nuts.
Mhm.
It just tore me up, but
Same.
really yeah.
Mm.
Oh, because they're so healthy. They got the good fat and protein, carbs. It was nice that it was almost like all three macros all at once. That's kind of why I loved them. But in all your talk with all this, this is a particular food question. I don't know if Ray ever talked about this. I thought maybe I saw he did, but can't remember about particularly stewed meat and cooking meat too long like that. If it becomes either more carcinogenic or just like hard to digest.
I think he would talk about that like when making bone broths. You
Hmm.
know, he didn't want I mean, when he's certainly made broths, he didn't want you cooking broths or the skins and everything more than like 5 or 6 hours. Yes, because he saw that the longer you cook it, the more it would denature the proteins, and then
Right.
on some level it was going to break it down more. I don't know about carcinogenic, but
Okay.
possibly. But yeah, I mean, he's just like, look, you want to cook some things for a certain amount, but when you cook them longer and longer and longer, it breaks them down more and more and more. And yes, and then you can have more byproducts that you might not want.
Right. Okay. And then, you know, it, I wanted to ask your view on serotonin. And how food can possibly relate with that. I know sometimes it can be triggered in the gut, but I one thing I just constantly hear from people is, you get all your serotonin from your gut, from the foods you eat and all this is it always good or can it potentially be harmful? Because I've heard it in both contexts, kind of like if you have an inflammatory response from food, it can send your serotonin high.
So it depends on what your beliefs are on this. I mean,
Hmm.
95% of your serotonin is produced in the gut, and 5% is probably produced in your brain. And so it is a neurotransmitter. Um, Excess serotonin, it would be considered more of a um, stress response. because you'll get in it, right? So excess serotonin can be a cause of migraines. It can also kind of increases serotonin, can also increase estrogen, can also increase histamine. So all of those can
Mm,
kind of like trigger each other. So having foods or things that irritate the bowels can increase serotonin. Certainly if you have a high amount of serotonin, you can have things like diarrhea. That's why the drug that's normally prescribed when you have diarrhea or nausea, called Zofran, is an anti-serotonin medication. So it decreases serotonin. So
mm,
some you want, right? But we also know, and that's why we know that depression is very linked to how the GI is, because there's so much serotonin being produced there. And so, right? So in a lot of these medications, like inhibit serotonin uptake or produce more
mhm,
serotonin, which might not be inherently good, because there's so many side effects to there. But one thing they do think is that, some of these people might have a messed up bowel, and and when your bowel is much slower and there's more things that can probably enter into your blood system, there could be more problems. So increases in serotonin can actually make the bowel move more. So for that reason, they
mm.
might feel better in general.
Oh,
But yeah, I don't think, I mean, serotonin, everything probably has good and bad. A little is fine. But yes, excess
right,
of that
right.
is not inherently a good thing.
Okay.
I mean, there's a lot of ways our diets have gone wrong, right? And when somebody is properly fueled, they have enough energy to fuel their systems, or what I would refer to as the basal metabolic rate, which is all the energy your body needs to function optimally at rest. And
Mhm,
that's a considerable amount of energy, right? If you don't do anything but just lay there, your body requires a ton of fuel just to stay alive and keep everything working. The hormonal system, nervous system, liver, detox, all of those things, and just maintaining yourself, meaning maintaining the muscle, maintaining the bone, that all takes energy. And so 60-70% of your needs actually go into your internal system to run everything. And then the rest is for you to walk and do things and think and so forth. But what happens is, specifically when we diet, our body has to make a decision at that point in time. And it's saying, hey, you're not consuming enough fuel for us to maintain your internal systems, and you're also doing more things externally, like you're exercising and doing all these things more. So we're having to make a decision to basically support your external needs, and then we're going to have to slow down some of your internal systems to basically keep yourself in some sort of a homeostatic place. And I
mhm,
always say, you're basically taking from Peter to pay Paul. Your body's always going to prioritize energizing those external things in your body, things outside of yourself, like you're walking and thinking and, you know, exercising, because your brain will kind of just decide to do that. And so your body just says, oh,
mhm.
okay, we don't have as much energy available now, so we'll just slow your digestion system down, or make your hormonal system more complicated, or maybe we'll just make you feel tired, because ultimately what we would like you to do is slow down. But we don't listen to any of those things, right? We don't think that those are actually cues for us. We just say, oh, I'm going to override those because I have things to do, and I'll continue to live my life. And that's what
Yep.
we end up doing. And you can do that periodically, right? We are
Right.
designed to be able to do that, but it's when we constantly do that and we stay in that space and we never give ourselves enough time to recover. And that could be years or decades that somebody might have been doing that. Yeah, ultimately you're going to start to pay the price of that. And then that's going to usually result in symptoms, illness, disease, whatnot. And so if you learn to kind of moderate that better, and
Mhm.
always understand, look, I need to maintain these certain things within my body, then you won't get yourself into so much trouble later on.
Gotcha. So well said.
Well,
Well,
thank you.
no problem. Thank you again. Have a great rest of your day, Kate.
You too. Take care.